I was just saying about Jurgen, what he believes is the best way to understand the nature of these realities is to experience them firsthand, make very careful observations, and document it. And that's what he's done in his book. And if you do read the book, you'll see how he's painstakingly documented his experiences over the past 40 years. He describes what I liked about it, he describes the experience, and then he reflects on what does that mean? What does that particular experience tell us about the nature of consciousness? And so that was kind of one of the fascinating things for me about his book. Jurgen attributes his intensive meditation practice with triggering and fostering his journeys out of body. And these journeys allowed him to explore the far reaches of what he describes as the multidimensional universe.
Hello everybody. Yes, as Bob was saying, I've been recording my out-of-body experiences since 1973, and in the initial stages it was quite an extraordinary thing that happened in my life, and it was like an adventure which was just totally unbelievable. Then over the last 40 years I took it more in my stride, but what I did is I kept a record of the events which as they happened, but I made sure that I only recorded events which were where I had full waking consciousness. And lots of these events were initiated via lucid dreams. And I found that the best way to have these experiences is to induce a lucid dream and then attain waking consciousness. And that's at the crux of the whole matter, is that I believe it is what I experience, everybody can experience, because it is just an extension of the reality. And I believe we all experience it anyway, which is in our dreams. The only difference is that we are not aware of it, that we haven't got waking consciousness in our dreams. And the easiest way to induce it is via lucid dreams, I found. And in the last 20 years, a lot of work has been done about it, especially by Stephen LaBerge, and he also runs workshops. And I believe that it's the best and the most natural route to get into this sort of state of consciousness and have your own experiences. When I recently, before the talk, I read last 3 years' journals which I kept open, and I read through them, and I discovered that most of my experiences came after I meditated, which usually happens very early in the morning. I tend to get up at about 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Then I do an hour or two of meditation. Sometimes the events happen during meditation, but very often what I notice they happen when I go back to sleep, let's say at about 6 o'clock, and then I have a lucid dream, and I program myself in a way that whenever I have a lucid dream, I make sure that I attain full waking consciousness. And the phenomena which I noticed is that there's a difference between lucid dreams and full out-of-body experience or waking experience. And the best way I can describe it is that a lucid dream is usually something where you attain wakefulness within a dream setting. So it's basically a dream where you are aware that you're dreaming, but you may actually carry dream elements around with you, which are some sort of narrative which you're still acting out, but you do so in full waking consciousness. But you're still, in a way, trapped in your dreams. And there's a lot of confusion where a lucid dream stops and an out-of-body experience begins. And I found an out-of-body experience begins the moment you attain full waking consciousness. And I also noticed the transition is usually accompanied by an experience that feels as if the dream content disintegrates. It seems to dissolve, and suddenly you are in an actual reality which is no different from our physical reality. And that is usually a turning point and very exciting. And the first thing I do when this happens is I focus my attention on the ground or anything that's near me, and until I see every detail. And in doing so, I'm waking my mind up. But when I'm fully awake, I'm not any longer I'm now in an alternate reality. And this is where I think the whole thing becomes very exciting and very enormous, really, because, I mean, in this alternate reality, a lot of things can happen. The environments can differ incredibly. I mean, it's like the environments on our Earth. You know, there can be desert or jungle or city, or it's just as diverse, if not more diverse, than what we have experienced here. And I think the first thing I would like to say is to describe really how difficult it is to convey some of the experiences, especially if they happen in an environment which are so alien to our physical environment. Is if you imagine you are a native living in the Amazon rainforest, and you have never seen anything else, and suddenly somebody plucks you out of the Amazon rainforest, blindfolds you, and dumps you in the middle of Piccadilly Circus and then removes the blindfolds, and then what you see may be totally incomprehensible to you. And after you adjusted your sights and your vision and your hearing, you will properly try to understand what it is you're looking at. So the person reporting back to his folks' home, he may say, looking at the big moving advertising boards, he may refer to as a giant tattoo, which is made out of millions of suns. So because we simply don't have the language to find words for what we encounter. Now, most out-of-body experiences I've spoken to and I've followed on forums, they usually report a setting which is very similar, very similar to our Earth setting. I think what I try to do when things became more complicated, I try to figure out, I worked out there are different levels of reality which we can experience, and I categorize them because the levels of reality vary according to your state of mind. The two things are very intricately linked. So consciousness is linked to the environment we experience. And I soon discovered a way of linking the two, and they have to do with the state of mind. And for each state of mind, there's a corresponding environment we enter into. And I don't know whether I can show you this. I've made a diagram. Let me just call it up. Basically, what I've done here is a diagram of how I see reality is. So I've broken it down into different dimensions or different levels. On the right-hand side, you see the first dimensional counterpart of Earth, which is simply a copy of our physical Earth. And people who first go into this dimension, they see very little discrepancy between the accustomed physical Earth and the environment they find. And then as they progress, the environment increasingly changes. On the lower levels, it is fairly sort of dark environment, and then it gets increasingly brighter until we get into an Earth-like environment. And I found that there are certain states of mind which correspond to the world which we experience. So I discovered the lowest dimensional level, there are people, it's usually inhabited by people who have got some psychological disorders. Either they are paranoids, or they may have ego problems or self-centered or issues. And then the next level, which gets a bit brighter, where people usually act out their personal self-adjustment issues, and the environment they enter into is also a corresponding dimensional level. And then as it rises higher to another level, we find that people on that level act out their suppressed wishes, and they're on a wish fulfillment level. And on the next level up is a self-actualization level, and one could almost associate it with Maslow's levels he described in his book. And then so it goes on and on.
Could I ask a question, Jurgen?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered on those states of mind, are those states of mind for living humans that are actually operating, in our current reality, and also those dimensions that you're describing?
Yes, I think it's both, really. People who, for example, when they go to sleep, they will probably find acting out their problems on different levels. And also these are environments where people usually are located when they die. And I had a lot of conversation with people, for example, with my mother, who died in 1997. And the first time I met her, she was in like some sort of prison cell or cocoon. And she suffered from depression. And it took quite a considerable time. I talked to my grandmother. She was with her most of the time, but she was totally inaccessible to me. And I felt really sorry for her. And she suffered severe depression before she died. And then after 2 years later, after I met her the first time, I had an out-of-body experience, and then I called her. And then I met her for the first time the way I remembered her. But at this time, she looked much younger and much healthier and much more together. And the first thing I recognized is when I hugged her, the first thing I recognized was a distinctive feeling she gave off, the heartfelt warmth and everything. And that was a very overpowering feeling, how I remembered her when she was still alive. And then we started a conversation, and she told me about the relationships with her second husband, when she died. And we had quite a long conversation, and it was very, very warm sort of encounter and very authentic. And since then, I kept contact with my mother, and I saw her and watched her progressing. And then my aunt died, and I also linked up with her. And I had sometimes conversations which lasted at least half an hour or so, where we went into great detail, where she even introduced me to her friends, which I remembered from my childhood, And this was a very intense experience. And I mean, it's almost difficult to believe, but I don't find it difficult to explain, because it's just an extension of our reality as we experience it here, because the feeling of the encounter is no different, the same wakefulness as we have on the physical earth, And I started very early on, got used to the fact that the people who live there, they're a very good source of information. So very often when I got out of my body and encountered people who were individuals like we are here, I started interviewing them and gathered a lot of information this way. And also the other thing I noticed, there are a number of people who are quite willing to also help you. So if you have any questions or if you have any requests, they will actually guide you and show you the territory. And also sometimes what happens is you are enlisted to perform some sort of service, which can happen out of the blue. And in my case, I have been asked to help people across the threshold. The very recent encounter was, if I switch back to show you some pictures in a minute, I wanted to. Sometimes I use the out-of-body experience to deepen my meditation, because when you do that, you get into a much higher state of mind and state of consciousness. So what I do is, the moment I am aware that I'm out of my body, I simply sit down again and carry on meditation, if it happens during the meditation. And then the effect is absolutely incredible. And very often it goes straight into a sort of ecstatic state of consciousness. And but it doesn't always work. This time I tried to do that, and I started lifting off into the air, and then I was suddenly brought back down to earth, and my attention was directed to a group of people. They were in some form of dark area, and one of the people, they also looked rather sick and unattractive. And the best way I can describe it was they looked like zombies, from the appearance, as if they had some sort of skin disease. And as I focused on one of the people, I recognized it was a woman, and I can show you a picture in a minute, which I drew. This is a very good representation of how she came across. So what I immediately found out, the moment I looked at her, I knew what she was all about. I could almost look into her. And I said, I asked her, do you know where you are? What happened to you? She said, I seem to be stuck in a nightmare, in a dream, and I don't know how to wake up. And so I told her, I'm sorry to tell you that you are actually dead, and she was quite shocked when I told her that. And when I looked at her, I found out how she died. I knew exactly what her background was, simply by being in her presence. And I knew that she was a prostitute, and she died of a heroin overdose. And the negative content of her experiences over the last few years, they were sort of all externalized in her appearance. There was very, very little positive aspects to her self, So I started comforting her because she started crying and breaking down. And I put my arm around her and then told her that this is not the end of the world. There's sort of something that can be done about it. And I started talking to her, and she started opening up. And I performed a bit of a counseling service. And gradually, as I was counseling her, and she was talking to me and opening up and feeling a lot more free about this, her appearance started to gradually change, and her normal human appearance sort of started showing through as we were walking along, until also the environment started to change and became much brighter, until we finally reached some sort of park area where we sat down on a bench, and I said, from here on you can just sort of get used to your new lifestyle, and there will be people who will be helping you. Now, this is a thing which happens to a lot of people I've spoken to, or who are on forums. They are enlisted to perform some sort of service there. And this is also a very good opportunity to learn about the mechanics of the next dimensional level. And I always quite happy to interview people, and then also these guides, they come along occasionally, and you befriend them. I learned the names of a few guides. One was called Philip, and he had quite a good sense of humor, and he was always sending me up when I made a request to go to a higher dimension and a higher level, because very often I found myself on a very drab sort of earth-like level, and I was very keen to get into the loftier sceneries. And he usually had some sort of task for me, which I had to perform before he would allow me to see some better worlds around on a higher level. Aware of is which I started to categorize the different levels of reality, and I mentioned earlier how they correspond to states of consciousness, and that the higher the state of consciousness, there's a corresponding environment which is in tune to the state of mind we are in. So it looks as if the different dimensional levels can be reached by a different level of consciousness. So the best way to pass from one level to another is to tune our consciousness to the next possible level. And I found that on the lowest dimensional level, the atmosphere is very dull and very bleak, really. And I think the reason for that is because there's much less creative energy is manifesting there. And the people are generally very self-absorbed and selfishly minded. There's very little creative energy. And on the even lower levels, the only creative energy may be coming from negative energy, like hatred and things like that. And the environments are correspondingly created. For example, I found out that if I went to a special place, I could see the atmosphere was materialized in the environment. For example, a very oppressive atmosphere was demonstrated by big towering blocks of concrete and bleak houses and things like that, houses with no windows or very little light. And so the atmosphere was very instantly recognizable, and the people were reflecting the atmosphere. So there was not much difference between what people were like and the environment they experienced. And the same happened, of course, on higher levels. The next level up is where people are trying to find themselves, and where people are much more open, but they still have conflicts. So that is a much more Earth-like environment. There are places like shops and everything we have here on this level exists there, and people acting out their life as if nothing has changed. They still go to work, they still have the old issues which they carry around, and so it progresses. I indicated earlier that different states of consciousness take you into a different environmental place, and I found one of the most interesting places, of course, are the places where people try to fulfill their dreams and the wish fulfillment levels, which are on the medium dimensions. And this is where a large number of people have spent most of their enjoyable times, and they're all acting out being lottery winners in a way. You know, to me it makes a lot of sense that the next reality is there to accomplish something. On the lower level, we realize that we have got to deal with our conflicts, our personality issues. And once these are resolved, we get into a much more harmonious state, and then we can address all our unfulfilled dreams and our unfulfilled desires. And I found these are really interesting levels because people are very creative on these levels. And these are probably what in the old days people would refer to as a summer land, in the old sort of clairvoyant literature. And it's quite understandable because it's like a perpetual summer. And the people are much more relaxed and much more at ease. It is much more enjoyable to spend time there with people because they're not so self-obsessed. They are more interested in creativity and creating environments which are totally to their liking and their pleasing. And there you find some interesting things taking place. And I went on a number of occasions. The equivalent to cities, there are on a totally different scale, where people have everything we have here, from very luxurious hotels and holidays resorts to anything you can possibly imagine or want. And people, there's literally no limit to what people get up to and how they enhance their lives there. And then once this is all, this is really something one could actually make a whole film about, and I sometimes wonder, the best way to illustrate it would actually to make a movie. If somebody, could do that would be the ideal thing. And then, of course, then it gets even better when you get to a more elevated level, where people, instead of fulfilling their dreams, they're trying to self-actualize, they're trying to fulfill their potential, and they are much more concerned with this welfare of each other and enriching each other and enhancing each other's lives. There's a much more greater social solidarity and awareness of other people. And aesthetics and art and beauty is on a totally different level. It is on these dimensional levels where I have the most enjoyable time, and also the most artistically, the most rewarding time, because it is here that people really come into their own and are very creative, and they do incredible things which are even the best Hollywood movies would not be able to express what can be visited here, what can be seen here. And I had the best, most enjoyable time, not just meeting people. I mean, when I met people, they were on a totally different level. You know, the communication was much better. In my book, I just described a small encounter with a woman I met in a house, a lady in the blue room, if you have the book. It was just the feeling and the wisdom of the people you meet there, the relaxedness and the empathy they show. And it's just something very rewarding to be there just for a few minutes, or for a few minutes in the presence of people like that, because they're on a much higher level of consciousness. And then to be in the environment, actually sit down and allow yourself to take everything in. It's an experience which is very difficult to describe, because it's so harmonious and synchronistic, everything. And the way you observe nature is totally different you see, for example, everything follows a certain pattern. There's a synchronicity and a symmetry in the environment, which is just totally breathtaking and awe-inspiring. And it's very easy to understand that when people visit these places, especially if they have full waking consciousness, that you may not want to go back, you know, after you've been there once. But I found out at some stage in 1980 that was not even everything you can experience. I have visited some places where I found it difficult to even understand what I was seeing, because they were of a richness and an experience which left me totally dumbstruck. It took me some time to, when I mentioned earlier a native from the Brazilian rainforest, you know, coming into London or something, that's a very, very good image, because I found myself in an environment where I had to take some time to get accustomed to what I actually saw and what I was experiencing. And me as an artist, that was an incredible eye-opener. You know, I suddenly saw things which I've never encountered before. And for example, the first impression I had was what I saw were flowers, you know, growing out of the ground, but they were not flowers, because they were there was energy going up the stems, and it was a rotating lights, what would have been the flower petals and things. And then the whole environment was totally different. You can imagine it is like landing on a different planet. And I became to realize that what I had experienced until then was simply variations of what we already know, but there are words which we don't know. I remember the chap called, and I didn't agree with that then, it was a chap called Kelly, and he said we can only experience what we experienced before. You know, there are no really new things, it's just a combination of old things, you know, which brings about new things. At least that's how I understood it, but I found that is totally wrong. You know, there is something which is, there are new experiences, and they are very, very powerful, you know. And when I went into these different worlds, I started taking notes, and they were very inspirational to create some of my illustrations, which I also have on my website. But some of the things which I became aware of later even put that in the shade. And this happened more recently. The first experience I had was in 1980, when I broke the barrier, which I call the material world, if you like, to the higher dimensional levels, and then went into the spiritual level, which was accompanied by a total sort of burn up of my social identity, and my self-image I had. I had to totally abandon this in order to get into this higher state of consciousness, and that was only possible with the help of a guide which I met earlier during my out-of-body experience, who actually gave me some training to enter these different dimensions. And I described it in my book in more detail, if you're interested to read up on it. And this guide then accompanied me into these totally new states of consciousness, which was a reflection of my initial peak experience, which started it all off, which I had in 1972, which I also described, and also on one of my videos online, you can look it up. That was a higher consciousness experience which was brought out spontaneously, and my out-of-body experiences seem to have followed up from that. And then in 1980 I had another this type of experience where I went into a totally new level of consciousness, which I also described over about 20 pages in my book, and I documented it as well as I could. And then recently I was asked on a forum by some people whether I could say something more about these dimensions, and I felt I couldn't because it was such a long time ago. But then something happened which brought a totally new aspect into my life, and that was when I became ill earlier last year, and I thought I probably only had about a year to live. I just wanted to also use that to say how relative things can be in life. When you come across a situation where you think, oh, well, that's really bad news, and you find it's actually the opposite. Because what happens, I found out several things. The first thing, I noticed that what I had experienced over the years during my out-of-body experiences had a physical effect, that I actually lost totally my fear of death or dying. I wasn't afraid. And so when I had the diagnosis, my first thing was, okay, all the people I knew, they only had about a year with cancer. Maybe that's my time now has come. And so instead of getting into a state of panic, I actually totally relaxed, because I also found that it's a great opportunity to find out for sure, what I'm sort of experimenting with. But the other thing was, I also became very aware of how beautiful life actually is, and I started focusing on the present a lot more, to such an extent that I've almost found myself in a continuous high. There was literally, every moment became very valuable and very powerful and full of meaning, and the days were very beautiful, and I felt really privileged. It was only when I found out that not everybody in my surroundings saw it like I did. My family, they tried to hide how they felt about it. They were actually quite distressed, and I became very conscious that it's not the way I wanted to end, and so I then had my operation. I had a couple of close brushes with death during the process, but I made a full recovery. But the beautiful thing that happened, I carried this feeling with me, this sort of new state of consciousness, which resulted in quite a few states, what I would call perhaps spiritual transformative experiences, STEs as they are known. And recently I had made contact with a group of people who formed as a result of their near-death experience. And I found that there was a lot of similarity between near-death experiences and voluntary experience. People who either had what I experienced through meditation or, or near-death experience. It's very, very closely related. This is really interesting because then I found out that a very much greater aspect of our reality is actually accessible, will be accessible to us, I believe, when we die. But also the other thing I would like to point out is that what I discovered there is actually at the very heart of our existence. That without this level of reality we would simply not be able to function, and that everything other than living in this state of consciousness is more or less a deviation from the norm. What I found there is something which is so much more human than what we normally experience, that I believe it should really be the basis of our humanity, and everybody really should have the experience, or try to have the experience. And what I find so exciting at the moment is that there are so many near-death experiences reports coming out and being published, that there's such a strong consensus in the state of consciousness. And simultaneously there's another guy who I've had regular correspondence with. His name is Steve Taylor. He teaches at Manchester University in psychology, and he has written a book which is called Waking from Sleep. And I find there are a lot of types of reports and thoughts are being put forward, which all converge at the same time, and it opens a totally new reality for us, which I think is at the heart of each one of us, and which we are all able to explore. The only thing I find which has stopped us so far is because our attention has been directed away from the center, or from the focus of our inner self, and we tend to be too much distracted, from our right brain hemisphere, if you like, which is more feeling orientated, more living in the present without goals or without pursuing an outcome. And I found this is something which is really very, very close at hand for all of us, and I think it's just a matter of focusing attention and getting closer into this field to experience it. And that was the biggest sort of lesson I got from this. But on the other hand, from the experiential level, the other thing which I found really, really interesting, especially for me as an artist, is also that the reality extends to an incredible degree beyond what we can even imagine, and I found it incredible that once in this state of consciousness, the world increases, or the diversity of the world increases potentially, exponentially. For example, you find yourself in an environment, and simply I remember floating through an incredible landscape. The thing is that in this state of consciousness, your experiences are incredibly enhanced as well, and the accompanying dimensional level, or the external level, if you like, in a way, is also incredibly enhanced. Everything becomes much richer, It's really very difficult to find actually words for it. The only way I would like to give you a picture, if you imagine the different landscapes we have on this planet, the beauty of it, but then this is to a much incredible degree better. And for example, I can just imagine one thing I experienced, which I also try to describe on my website. I was drifting through a landscape which was like a delta with incredible rich vegetation, But then when I look closer at the vegetation, it was something which was totally, I've never come across. You know, I was then drifting through a valley with a river inside, and rocks on either side, and from these rocks there were some organic shapes protruding, and they were continuously changing. The best picture I can properly imagine is like a drug experience, you know, because it's not just that you experience a landscape, but you feel that the landscape you experience responds seamlessly with your thoughts and your feelings. There's no divorce between who you are and your external world. It's all one, and yet you experience what you experience in front of you, outside you, if you like, but it's organically linked. So the moment you shift your attention, or the moment you look at something in particular, that particular object you look at becomes enhanced and unfolds. The other thing I notice is, for example, that sounds which appear, that sounds have actually shapes. And if you follow a sound, then the sound expands in its shape, in its shapes, and it can unfold. Or you can even take a word. One word which I illustrated was the word love. The moment you have the word in front of you, it becomes a thought, and the thought becomes a reality, and it expands and unfolds like a living organism. And the organism sort of sprouts leaves and things, and each leaf which it unfolds has a meaning. And the meaning takes you into a deeper level of understanding of the object you're looking at. And it's incredible how the connectedness with the thought, the feeling, and yourself, and the understanding that goes with it is on a level which is can simply not be experienced on this normal thought processes, which are linear. You know, here you get into a thought dimension where instead of having to think or taking effort into the thought, you actually have the thought unfolding in front of you to its final analysis, to its final destination, and not only as a thinking process in an abstract way, but as a very physical, in inverted comma, way, which has shape, form, and an instant understanding and comprehension of what it means. For example, the color immediately gives you information of an aspect of the thought. Simply by looking at the color, you understand another dimension of the meaning of it. And then in addition to that, you have the sound of the object you're thinking about. There's a sound associated to every thought, and you follow the sound and you understand the meaning of the sound. And this is an experience which is totally new. And I think the best word I can come up with is synesthesia. You know, where sounds have shape and color, and shapes have sounds component. You know, it's a convergence of every sort of auditory or visual form. And I was thinking, when I was a student, I was taught by a pupil of Kandinsky at art school, and of course Kandinsky always spoke about that colors have certain sounds. For example, he would say yellow is a trumpet and things like that. And it's very much that sort of feeling, you know, you get there's a wholeness in the experience, that there's no separatedness. The senses are not separated. And I was thinking, the book Rick Strassman wrote about DMT, the spirit molecule. And I find if people wanted to explore more these states of consciousness, then probably drugs could be a very useful method of investigating it. The only thing I found which was lacking with Rick Strassman's subjects was, I don't think he's chosen them very well. He should have chosen, instead of choosing people who had drug experiences, he should have chosen people who were self-actualized, who didn't have any personal issues to resolve this and take into the experiment. Because the problems with drugs is, if you still carry an ego identity around with you and issues, unresolved issues, these will take you into places which become very subjective and not very objective. And the only objective state of consciousness we can only attain if we become reality aware. And in order to become reality aware, we have to leave our social identity, leave it at one side, and our ego identity, and become just awareness, reality aware, being in the here and now without any attachments and without any judgments. And that, I think, is the only state of consciousness which makes science of the higher states of consciousness possible, by being able to observe in an objective way. And I found if Rick Strassman was going to repeat his experience, his research, he should recruit his subjects from this type of psychological profile, and then the reports will be much more objective. And then if people, I believe that drugs, they have been used, throughout history in a very intelligent way. And I think we can actually get more information this way, as well as by interviewing out-of-body experiences, and also people who have had near-death experience. And we will very soon find that whatever the data are which people present, there's a very close link between the different reports people give,
Yes, I did have a question on that, Jurgen. I think you kind of hit on an excellent idea. I think a lot of the writers on out-of-body experience, and also some on the near-death experience, there does seem to be a lot of similarities in their writing, both on the way that they were able to attain the state, and then also on what they encountered in terms of the different levels or dimensions. It sounds like there's really a need to have some kind of comparative study that compares the different writers and looks for the commonalities to really get at the underlying reality.
Yes, I think even, in psychiatry, I worked for a short time in a mental hospital, in a psychiatric unit, and with schizophrenic people. And some of the people I had a lot of conversations, and I found that some of the people, the way they perceive reality, it's totally sane when you adopt their viewpoint, because what they report is what they see. And I found that the person is not actually mad. They're just reporting an experience which they have, which we don't have, and that makes them appear mad, and things like that. And I had one out-of-body experience where I came back and I was talking to somebody in my out-of-body experience, and I came back into my body, and without waking up, I just became aware of my physical surrounding, and I could still hear the person talking right next to my ear, and I still carried on the conversation in my head, and he would still respond while I had the consciousness of being in a physical reality. And at that moment it struck me, this is how schizophrenic people may experience reality. They simply mix the realities together. So we shouldn't be too dismissive about schizophrenic people, and maybe enlist them as part of a research program. The only problem is, of course, is when schizophrenic people develop paranoia, and so their subjectiveness interferes with objective experience. But the way I saw it and I experienced is that people with schizophrenia experience an alternate dimension, a reality which they superimpose onto the world where we, which we share, and this makes it so difficult. But the same thing happens, for example, if you take another aspect, which is clairvoyance. clairvoyance report, they can see or hear people. They also shift their awareness to different levels of reality. So all these different categories of perception which are reported, they're all very, very closely related. And I think a good way forward is to start comparing these different experiences, and maybe we get a bit further. The other thing I think we should also try to experiment with and put a lot of effort in is developing lucid dreams, because that is the most natural and the easiest way to gain access to higher dimensional realities.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, Jenny had a comment that even though there are some techniques out there, like from LaBerge and others, for attaining lucid dreaming, it also does seem to be a pretty elusive state to capture for most folks.
Yes, I think once it's more widely accepted that this actually is a reality of consciousness, which accepts, I think more research effort should be made to, first of all, I think we already know where lucid dreams, which areas of the brains are affected or active during lucid dreams. If some effort was made to pursue this and properly bring different things together, I sent you the link to the light generator,
right.
And things like that. I think it should be possible to advance our knowledge a little bit more by having a more concerted effort. I think we are in the same stage at the moment with regard to higher dimensional realities as we were before Freud came on the scene and started opening psychology up for us. Until then we knew very little. And I think we are almost at the same point now where we get more and more reports from people, but we haven't actually yet made the jump into opening this whole territory up for research and seeing it really as an expansion of our reality, rather than as something mysterious or something occult, something to do with Ouija boards or something, is something which I feel is very, very natural, and in due course more and more people will have to become aware, and then hopefully it will be taught in schools, perhaps,
In terms of sort of fostering the kind of consciousness that would allow one to attain out-of-body experience or lucid dreaming, you've mentioned several times that your intensive meditation practice, you believe, had a lot to do with your ability to get there. And I haven't finished your book yet, so you may mention it, but I haven't seen anything yet on, could you describe a little more about, there are thousands of types of meditation practices. Could you say a little more about the type that you use or how it's changed over the years?
I think throughout all my life I was never really interested in out-of-body experience. They were just sort of like a byproduct of meditation. All I really was interested in was reality awareness, to find out really what is at the ground level of everything, what is everything made of, what I am made of. So my meditation is always focused around awareness, and I also found this helped me when I had out-of-body experiences, to be aware rather than being carried away by dreams or dream images or fantasies, but to actually be still and focus on what is happening around you. And I think this was instrumental in making the transition from a lucid dream into establishing awareness on a different level of reality, and then observing it in the same objective manner as we would observe our physical environment, But of course, this can only happen if we are free of the sort of noise from the brain and the distractions from our thoughts. And that's why I find meditation is very useful and very helpful. And then once we come to this sort of focus point, it's a lot easier to focus on maybe lucid dreaming. Maybe then when we start focusing more attention on our dream activity, we increase automatically the possibility of becoming aware of our dream activity. And once we've become aware of our dream life more, it becomes a much stronger part of our reality. We pay more attention to our dreams. And then we can look out for certain patterns in our dream. And I always found, when I looked through my notes, the point where I became aware in my dreams was usually a stimulus which made me see that there's something which cannot happen, And that was always a trigger, and I programmed myself to look out for something that cannot happen, And it's incredible how this gradually takes root and how you can build on it. Once this becomes a reality, then the next time it's easier to attain. And sometimes it's overwhelming. The experience is very overwhelming. I had a meditation last summer when I was in meditation, and suddenly I went into a very deep sort of drowsiness, and I must have passed out or fallen asleep. And then I suddenly woke up again, and I suddenly found myself, I was walking along Brighton Beach, which is about 15 miles from where I meditated. But I didn't think that I was meditating. I thought, oh, I've forgotten where I parked my car. It was so real that I thought, oh, I've had a bit of amnesia. I wonder where I parked my car. And I was walking along the beach thinking, oh, I must have, come here to take photographs or something. That was the first thing. And I didn't realize I was out of my body at this. I was walking along, I was observing the pebbles on the beach, the sea sort of coming in, and then I thought, there's no way I could have gone here. And then I remembered I was meditating, And then I thought the only way to test it is see if I can hover above the ground. And this was the only clue which I had that I was actually out of my body. The reality was so powerful, physical, that there was no other clue I could have worked out that I was, in a different reality. And these sort of things can happen when we focus more attention, to our sort of inner life, really, It, yes.
Question?
As you have been talking about the results of your meditations, could you please talk about it, how you do it, and if it changed with time? I mean, you found new avenues, new techniques, new variations.
Yeah, I changed my meditation. It depends very much on the feeling. One technique which I quite enjoy is a breathing technique where I breathe in through the base of my spine, follow the breath going up, and then when it reaches, I imagine it reaches the top of my head, and then I breathe out. But instead of breathing, don't just breathe out. I totally surrender. I surrender myself, my identity. In the only way I can describe it is like a sort of feeling of a wave of love, or giving myself. That surrenders my ego identity, and so I follow this rhythm through, and after a while I get into a very high state of very subliminal state. And there's just one technique which I use, and then another technique is simply to be aware, and then if a thought comes up, I'm just trying to be aware without any thought, just the feeling of itness, of beingness, in its purity, and just let everything else that sort of tries to interfere with it, I just let this pass by, and that too can lead to very high states of consciousness, and very beautiful, sublime states of awareness. And the other thing I became much more aware of over the last sort of 12 months, and also before, but much more now, is a feeling of being, a being feeling, of existing without any attributes, just the fact that you are living and alive. And that has a feeling that as if you are not on your own. There's almost feels as if somebody is always with you, you know, like a presence, you know. And I I refer to it as my silent companion. You know, it's almost as if you are in the presence of a greater identity, of a greater being, you know, and you have a two-way rapport with this feeling. And I find I also use it in meditation, that I surrender myself to this presence, you know, to this being. And I heard people refer to it as a higher self, or the right side of the hemisphere, or there are lots of different names. There's been, or the daemon, you know. There are lots of names for it, but it has very often been reported by people who had religious experience. But this has become very much an everyday thing now. You know, the moment I open my eyes, I feel in the presence of some itness, which makes me feel that I'm not on my own. You know, and you can always rely on it. You know, your whole state of mind changes. You don't see yourself as a separate individual anymore. Another way of putting is like if you go out into town, it doesn't feel like a strange place. It feels like the extension of your living room. You know, you are never an alien. You know, you're always on home ground. You know, and this is very often reported by people who had near-death experiences. They felt they had come home and arrived home, you know. And I think it's nurturing these experiences which allows us to accept the whole spectrum of realities around us, you know, and tune into aspects. I think it makes it easier to open ourselves up to new experiences. I still don't. I still can't say sit down and say, okay, I want to have an out-of-body experience. It still doesn't work like that. I still feel it needs to be. I need to either be invited, or I have to spontaneously get there. But having said that, I never felt really motivated to have the experience as such. And since last year, I lost a little bit of interest in out-of-body experience, because this much higher experience sort of supersedes it, you know. But the most important thing I find is that this is so much at the basis of our being, and no person is exempt from this. You know, we all share this, and that's what I find so exciting about it. It should be the common denominator for being. It shouldn't be an exception. And I can't help but feel that we are just sort of bits of an hair away from it. You know, there's just so it appears to be the most natural state of being, and the reason we don't experience is because we are distracted. You know, that's the only thing. We are distracted and focused on things which are non-essential to that experience.
Okay, I just want to ask any other question. I know we're coming up on about 90 minutes. Other questions that folks, Jenny?
Yes, I was fascinated when you were describing your experience in the world beyond, and you ran into someone who had recently crossed over. I was wondering if you had gained any understanding of why people come here, and reincarnation, and maybe why you came here. Did you meet anybody who was about ready to cross back over? Why why don't we just stay there if it's so wonderful?
Yes. Well, I basically, the way I see it is really, I see it in terms of consciousness wanting to create as many experiences as possible, and we are all sort of outcrops of consciousness. We are simply here for consciousness to gather data and experiences, and we use this experience in order to have our own experience and develop from that. But at the same time, the greater consciousness uses us to advance its own experience. That's how I sort of understand it, really. And with regard to reincarnation, I think it's basically the drive to follow up on certain experience which we haven't finished with, or which we would like to have, or we feel attracted to, So our consciousness sort of carries on wanting to experience, having a need for experience. The best example is my father. As I mentioned, my father died when I was 9 years old. And when my mother died in 1997, and I met her, I never met my father. And I asked my mother whether she knows where my father is. And she said she met him on a couple of occasions, but she is not in contact with him. And then, I had an out-of-body experience. I have to tell you first that my father died. My father's parents died when he was 2 years old, and he grew up in an orphanage. And then one out-of-body experience, I asked, I want to see my father. Take me to my father. I shouted it out, and I was whisked away, and I suddenly found myself on a remote farm in eastern Russia. And I saw two boys. One was about 10 years old and the other one was 9 years old. And one boy, he stopped on his bicycle. They were both riding a bicycle, and he stopped, and in his thought, he said to me, "Jurgen," he called my name. And I recognized that it was my father. It was a 10-year-old boy. And immediately I recognized that the other boy, who parked his bicycle a bit further, who also stopped, was his father, which he lost when he was 2 years old. And then at the same time I had the picture of his mother also being around, being his mother. So what he did is he recreated the family life which he never experienced, And that was an amazing experience, because I also noticed that he still recognized me on this sort of mental level. He called my name. So the astral body, which people refer to as the astral body, is still a coherent entity which carries all the experience around with it. Not of the not just of one life, but also of the past life. And this explains a lot when people sort of go into regressions and into deep hypnosis, and they re-experience past lives. It all makes sense to me now, And it also made sense to me when I talked to my mother, and she said she doesn't see him so often, but she still sees him, And it's just incredible how consciousness works on so many different levels and in such incredible diverse way. We can barely sort of comprehend.
Any other questions? Yes.
You speak often of the increased clarity you experience on these higher dimensions. Is there any way to bring this back to our plane?
I think the answer is really, I think our nervous system acts a bit like a filter, really, which tends to prevent us from bringing the clarity across. I noticed when in some of the out-of-body experience, you actually feel you're waking up from a dream. Some of them are so hyper vivid, that you feel your physical life is like a dream, really, And then when you get back into your physical body, the old filter has sort of come back into action, and all the clarity is filtered out. But that doesn't mean it's not possible to get a certain amount of clarity, bring it across, because when Buddha, for example, talks about he talks about awakening, you know, that when you get into a higher state of consciousness, you're actually waking up from the dream, and I found since last year that there's a bigger clarity now about life. Simply because there's less distraction, there's more focus on reality, you know. So the filters, you remove the filters more and more, and you live life more intensively, you know. And one way of describing it, the best way of describing it graphically, is when you go to work, let's say, a route which you follow every day, you know, the same route, and you tend to say, oh, I'm really bored here, I want to take another route. But if you are living in the present, every part of the way is new. It's always a new experience. Everything you experience is a new experience, is an authentic experience. There's no repetition, you know, and it's more, you become more alive. You're more focused on what is behind it rather than how it appears. And I noticed, I was talking to my wife about it, visually everything changes as well. You know, you become much more aware of beauty spots, or you become more aware of things which are beautiful. And if you do become aware of it, they have a tremendous feeling, effect on your experience. It's almost you are living on the edge of ecstasy most of the time, and it only needs a very small pinprick to bring it out to the open, you know. And another thing which I noticed more and more is that but the visual stimulus are more harmonic. On my website I did a picture, especially if I walk along a road, let's say it's tarmac and there are lots of pebbles and things. I find as I walk along that these pebbles form themselves into symmetric patterns. And I think the reason for that is that your awareness is programmed more from a higher dimensional level, which is more symmetrical. So you're using that to project the symmetry which you experience at the core of your being. You project the symmetry into the external world. So you can see a more harmonious, the world is more harmonious, you know, the perception is more harmonious. And that doesn't just apply to vision, it also applies to sound, especially if you're in a quiet environment, like in nature. You suddenly find that the bird song and the wind and the water, it all sort of comes together to form some sort of soundtrack, you know, which is almost as if it has been composed. So your aesthetic awareness becomes much more enhanced. And I think that's simply due to the fact that we are less distracted by thoughts, you know, and we are more, we allow ourselves more to be absorbed by the reality, which creates things, you know, which makes things happen. We are more in tune with the original force that assembles the universe around us, you know. And I also think that creation is something that didn't just happen at the Big Bang. It is something that happens every single second, you know, that the universe is assembled every moment, and we can always take an active part in the creation, you know, be part of it. And yeah, I mean, that's basically the way I see it.
Thank you. Great. Any other last questions? Okay, Jurgen, I just want to thank you so much for your time. I think in spite of the few little interruptions,
we can always edit them, can't we?
Yes, and I think it was easy to follow from this end, so I don't think we lost too much.
Okay.
And yeah, from everyone here, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
I'll be in touch.
Okay, thanks very much. Very kind of you.